There is a number buried in the British supply records of the Western Desert that nobody in 1942 wanted to say out loud. A convoy leaves a fuel depot behind the lines carrying 70,000 gallons of petrol. It crosses open desert. It is not bombed. It is not strafed. It is not ambushed by armored cars or raided by the long-range desert group's opposite numbers. It arrives at the forward dump with 30,000 gallons. 40,000 gallons of aviation-grade and vehicle-grade fuel, hauled thousands of miles across an ocean at the cost of ships and sailors and convoy escorts, simply stops existing somewhere between the loading ramp and the tank leaguer. And the officer who signs the receiving paperwork does not raise an alarm. He does not order an investigation. He writes it up as an acceptable delivery. Because by the standards of that campaign, in that summer, with the containers his army had been issued, losing more than half a convoy's fuel to nothing at all was considered a reasonably good run. That is where this story starts. Not with a battle. With a stain in the sand. The fuel was not stolen. It was not siphoned off by black marketeers in Alexandria, though some certainly was. The great majority of it seeped, dripped, evaporated, sweated, and burst its way out of the containers it was being carried in, a pint here and a quart there, across 10,000 tins, on every mile of every track between the coast road and the front. It went into the sand. It went into the air. It went into the wood of the packing crates, and the canvas of the truck beds, and the boots of the men unloading it. It was, in every operational sense, delivered directly to the enemy, because every gallon that failed to arrive was a gallon. A tank could not burn, and a tank that cannot burn fuel is a 5-ton steel coffin sitting still in open ground. And the entire problem had already been solved. Not partially, not theoretically, completely. The solution had been designed, tested, refined, and mass-produced. It existed in green-painted steel, in warehouses in Germany, in the back of every Africa Corps supply truck, in captured dumps that Allied soldiers were picking over with something close to reverence. The Americans got hold of it. They took it apart. They measured every dimension of it. They photographed it, weighed it, analyzed its steel, worked the cap mechanism until they understood exactly how it functioned. And then they built their own version and changed one single feature. 1. It is a detail you cannot see from the outside. You could hold the German can and the American can side by side at arm's length and never spot the difference. Soldiers in the desert spotted it within a week because it announced itself as a smell. To understand how badly the British and Americans were losing this fight, you have to understand what a soldier in 1942 was actually handed when he was told to go and fetch petrol. For the British, it was a thing everyone in 8th Army called a flimsy, and the nickname was not affectionate. It held 4 imperial gallons. It was made of tin plates so thin you could dent it with a thumb, folded and soldered along its seams, with a small opening at the top. It had been designed for a world where fuel moved by rail and canal, and sat in a depot until somebody needed it, and in that world it worked well enough. It was cheap. It could be produced by the million by any small factory in Britain with a press and a soldering line. It was light enough for one man to carry 2 of them. On paper, it was a sensible piece of wartime economy. The desert took that piece of sensible wartime economy apart in a matter of hours. 2 of these tins would be packed into a wooden case for transit. Later, as timber grew scarce, the cases became plywood. Later still, they became cardboard. The containers were treated as effectively single-use, thrown away once they had been drained, because nobody expected them to survive a second journey, and mostly they did not survive the first. Stack them more than a few high, and the bottom ones buckle under the weight. Drop one from the tailgate of a lorry, which happens perhaps 40 times a day in a busy dump, and the solder cracks along a seam. Load them into a 3-tonner and drive that lorry across desert corrugations, that endless washboard ripple in the hard pan that shakes a vehicle at a frequency engineered by nature, to destroy everything bolted to it, and the tins work against each other for hours, edge on edge, seam on seam. Then the sun comes up properly, and the metal skin of a truck bed climbs past 50 degrees Celsius, and the petrol inside each tin expands with nowhere to go, and the weakest solder joint in the batch gives up. The war correspondent Alan Moorhead, who watched more of this than most, described the ritual bluntly. You put a couple of petrol tins in the back of a truck, you drove for 2 hours over rock, and then you noticed the smell. Everyone noticed the smell. Vehicles moving in the western desert trailed a haze of evaporating petrol behind them like a slow fuse, and men learned not to think about that too hard while they were smoking. General Auchinleck, commanding in the Middle East, put the loss at around 30% of everything shipped forward. Some quartermaster units logged 40. And then there was that convoy, the 70,000 that arrived as 30,000, a 57% loss on a single documented run, and the shrug that accompanied it. Now, the Americans arriving in theater had every reason to feel superior about this, and no right to. Their own containers were older in concept than the flimsy and only marginally better in practice. There was a rectangular 5-gallon can with a screw cap sealed by a cork gasket, a design essentially unchanged since 1917. Cork gaskets dry out. Cork gaskets crumble. Cork gaskets take a set when a cap is over-tightened by a tired man in the dark, and then they never seal properly again. The screw cap itself needed a wrench to shift once it had been cranked down and then baked in the sun for a week. And pouring from it was a 2-man operation with a funnel. 1 man to hold and tip. 1 man to steady and aim. Half a minute of careful work per can with fuel glugging out in irregular slugs because air could not get in past the outgoing stream. Try doing that at night, under blackout, on a slope, with an air raid on. The alternative was the 55-gallon drum, which is a superb container for a refinery and an absurd one for a war of movement. It weighed close to 400 pounds full. It needed a pump, or a bung wrench and a tilting cradle, or a truck-mounted hand crank. It could not be carried by a man. It could not be handed up to a tank crew. It could not be thrown into the back of a jeep. It was designed for a fuel dump, and a fuel dump is a fixed point, and the entire nature of desert warfare in 1942 was that there were no fixed points. So that was the Allied fuel system in the year the Allied fuel system nearly lost the campaign. Tins that split, cans that needed tools, drums that needed machinery. Meanwhile, when Allied troops overran Axis supply dumps, they kept finding something else. Green steel containers, rectangular, flat-sided, with an odd X pressed into each face and 3 handles welded across the top. They held about 20 liters, a shade over 5 gallons. They had been sitting in the Libyan sun for months, thrown off trucks, stacked 6 high, dragged across rock, and they still looked serviceable. No weeping seams, no stains under the stack, no smell. Allied soldiers who were not fools worked out very quickly what they had found. Captured German fuel cans became one of the most prized objects in the desert, valued above enemy weapons, above enemy binoculars, above almost anything a man could carry off a battlefield except food. Units hoarded them and hid them from other units. Supply officers wrote requests asking specifically for captured enemy containers by name, which is a remarkable thing to find in a British quartermaster's file. After the second capture of Benghazi at the very end of 1941, enough of them fell into British hands to re-equip whole formations, and the long-range desert group, whose entire existence depended on carrying fuel 1,000 miles into nothing and getting back again, threw away their flimsies. By early 1942, the LRDG was running on captured German cans exclusively. Men whose lives were arithmetic, whose survival was a function of how much petrol reached the far end of a trip, made their decision without hesitating. The British had a name for them by then, taken from the slang word for a German. Jerry cans. Here's what the Allies were holding in their hands and did not yet properly understand. The container was officially the Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, the Armed Forces Standard Canister, and it did not appear by accident or by inspiration. It came out of a competitive tender run in 1935 and 1936. in which the German army specified what it wanted and let engineering firms compete to deliver it. The winning design came from an engineer named Vinzenz Grünvogel at the Müller Engineering Works in Schwelm in Westphalia. 5,000 test cans went out to troops in 1936 for field trials, which is the step everyone skips and nobody should. Soldiers used them, abused them, broke some, complained about others, and the design came back and was refined. Only on the 8th of July 1937 was it formally adopted by Army order. 3 years from concept to adoption. 3 years of arguing about a fuel container in a country that was in an enormous hurry to build an army. That patience is the whole story. And by 1939 the German military had stockpiled the things by the 100,000. Motorized units were issued cans together with lengths of rubber hose, so that a crew could siphon fuel out of any tank they came across, military or civilian, friendly or captured. In Poland, that combination of a fast-pouring container and a hose meant German columns could refuel from whatever they found by the roadside and keep going while their opponents waited for a supply organization to catch up. The design was classified. The patent was filed in 1939 and kept out of public view. Germany understood exactly what it had. So look at the thing properly, because every part of it is an argument. It is built from 2 sheets of steel, pressed into shape and joined down the middle. 20 liters, which is about 5 1/3 US gallons, chosen because that is roughly the heaviest load a man can swing up onto a truck bed all day without wrecking his back. Pressed into each face is that X, and the X is not decoration, and it is not a manufacturer's flourish. It does 3 jobs at once. First, it stiffens the panel. A flat sheet of thin steel that size will oil can, flex, and eventually fatigue and crack. Crease it into 4 triangular sections, and the same steel becomes dramatically more rigid without adding a gram of weight. Second, it handles expansion. Petrol swells by roughly 2 to 3% when it heats up, and in the desert it heats up every single day. The indentation flexes outward and gives that expanding fuel somewhere to go instead of loading the seams with pressure. Third, and this is the part people forget, it handles the other direction. When the sun goes down and the temperature drops 40 degrees in a few hours and the fuel contracts, the indentation flexes back inward rather than letting a vacuum form and suck the panels in. That single pressed crease is a rigidity solution, a pressure relief valve, and a vacuum breaker, and it costs nothing because it happens in the same press stroke that forms the panel. The 3 handles look like over-engineering until you learn where they came from. The Army had specified that a soldier must be able to carry 2 full cans or 4 empty ones. Work backwards from that requirement, and you arrive at exactly this arrangement. 2 short handles at the outer edges and 1 long handle across the middle. One man takes the outer handles of 2 cans, 1 in each hand, and walks. Or he takes 4 empties, 2 per hand, hooking a finger set through the pairs. 2 men can carry 1 can between them up a slope. And in a chain of men unloading a truck, the top handle is exactly where the next pair of hands expects it to be, so cans move down the line without anyone looking. The handles sit flush with the top of the can so that a stack sits square and does not rock, which means you can build a wall of them 6 high in a moving truck, and it will still be a wall when you arrive. Then the cap, which is the piece that turned the container from good into unbeatable. It is not a screw top. It is a cam lever. You flip the lever and the seal releases in 1/4 of a second, with your hand, in the dark, in gloves, with no tool of any kind. And behind the opening runs a breather tube down into the body of the can, so that as fuel leaves, air comes in along its own path. That is why a German can pours in a smooth continuous stream instead of the choking glug 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 of every other container in the world. 1 man, 1 can, no funnel, no second pair of hands, no wrench, and the whole 20 liters is gone in seconds. There was even a hole in the closure retainer so a wire seal could be run through it, which meant a depot could prove whether a can had been opened between dispatch and delivery. Somebody thought about pilfering too. Inside, the steel carried a protective coating to stop corrosion contaminating the fuel, and there was a lining in the fuel version specifically. And built into the shape of the body was an air chamber that would keep the can floating if it went into water, which sounds like a fussy detail right up until you are running a beach landing, and cans are going over the side of a landing craft in the surf. Now the part that decided everything. Where the two pressed halves meet, the German can is welded. The edges are brought together and joined by electric resistance welding along the line of the X, and the weld sits recessed below the surface of the panel where it will not catch on anything and will not be the first thing to take an impact. It is a continuous, homogeneous, metallurgically bonded joint. The two halves stop being two halves and become one piece of metal. It does not have a gap to open because it does not have a gap. Nothing on that can is arbitrary. Nothing on it is there because it looked right. Every feature is the answer to a question somebody asked in a field trial in 1936, and you can reverse engineer the question from the feature. That is what 3 years of development buys you, and it is why the thing still looked new after a Libyan summer. The way this design reached America is one of those wartime stories that sits somewhere between documented fact and workshop legend, and I will give you both halves of it honestly. In 1939, an American engineer named Paul Pleiss was in Germany, and he and a German colleague built themselves a vehicle for an overland journey to India. The car was finished before either of them noticed a problem that would have killed them somewhere in Persia. They had made no arrangement for carrying emergency water. The German engineer, by the account, had access to a stockpile of the new army cans at Berlin's Tempelhof airport, and came back with 3 of them, along with the full manufacturing specifications for how they were made. The 2 men set off. Somewhere on the road, the German was recalled by his government, and Pleiss went on alone. He is supposed to have reached Calcutta, put the car into storage, and flown home to Philadelphia, where he did what any reasonable person would do. He went to the American military and told them about the best fuel container in the world, which he had personally driven halfway across Asia, and whose complete manufacturing drawings he was holding. Nobody was interested. Not slightly. He could not get a meeting that led anywhere, and he eventually worked out why. He was a man with a story and no object. Without a can on the table, he was one more enthusiast with an opinion about equipment, and the War Department received those by the sackful. So he arranged, by a roundabout route, to get the car shipped to New York, and he sent one of the cans to Washington. Parts of that journey cannot be confirmed from surviving records, and I would rather say so than pretend otherwise. What can be confirmed is the thing that matters. In the summer of 1940, samples of the German fuel can were sitting in the office of the Quartermaster General of the United States Army. Later that same year, when Pleiss was in London, British officers who had heard something about the design asked him to explain it, and he had the second of his 3 cans flown over to them. So by the end of 1940, both the American and British armies had the German container in their hands, with more than a year to go before Pearl Harbor, and nearly 2 years before the fuel crisis in the desert reached its worst. The Americans said no. There is no clean paper trail explaining why, which is itself a kind of answer. Bureaucracies file their triumphs and misplace their embarrassments. What can be reconstructed is a mood rather than a decision. Some resistance to adopting a foreign design wholesale. Some doubt about whether American plants could economically produce that welded body. Some ordinary institutional inertia from an organization that already had a container in the catalog and did not want a new line item. Instead of the German can, the War Department chose to go with a 10-gallon container inherited from the First World War, closed by 2 screw caps, requiring a spanner to open and a funnel to pour. Read that sequence again. In 1940, the United States Army had on its desk a one-man, no tools, 20-liter can with a welded body, a cam lever, and a breather tube, developed over 3 years of field trials, and it responded by ordering a 2-decade-old design that needed 2 tools and 2 men. Eventually, Camp Holabird in Maryland picked it up. The Quartermaster Corps research facility there agreed to actually evaluate the German container, and to their credit, they did it thoroughly. They measured every dimension. They photographed every feature. They worked the cam lever mechanism, tested the seal, analyzed the composition of the steel, understood the geometry of the X. And then, in late 1940 and into 1941, they redesigned it. Understand that they got almost everything right. The American engineers kept the 20-liter capacity and the external dimensions, so cans would stack and pack the same way. They kept the 3 handles in the same arrangement. They kept the cam lever closure. They kept the X pressed into both faces, slightly simplified but functionally intact. Someone looking at the 2 containers on a bench would have called them the same object. What they changed was how the 2 halves of the body were joined together. Instead of welding the seam, the American design rolled it. The edges of the 2 pressed halves are folded over one another and crimped tight, the way the lid of a paint tin or the side of a food can is crimped. It is a completely legitimate manufacturing technique, and there are excellent reasons an engineer would reach for it. It is much faster. It does not require welding equipment or the skilled operators to run it. It suits high-volume presses in factories that had never welded anything in their lives and were about to be asked to produce containers by the million. It was cheaper on every unit forever. They also, in some versions, simplified or removed the internal breather tube, which meant the can lost its smooth single-man pour and went back to needing a funnel or a separate spout. And they left out the interior lining that the German fuel cans carried. The result weighed 10 pounds empty against 11.5 for the German original, and I suspect somewhere there is a memo listing that weight saving is a benefit. 1.5 pounds per can, multiplied across millions of cans, is real tonnage. On a spreadsheet, it looks like a win. That 1.5 pounds was the metal that made the seam hold. Here is the physics, and it is not complicated, which is what makes it painful. A rolled seam is a mechanical joint. It is 2 layers of metal folded around each other and squeezed, held together by friction and by the sealing compound between them. It is not one piece of metal. It is 2 pieces of metal being pressed against each other and asked to behave like one. And a mechanical joint under repeated stress does what all mechanical joints under repeated stress eventually do. It works. Now put it in the desert. Daytime temperature on the steel skin of a can in direct sun goes well past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it falls 40 or 50 degrees. Every day, that seam expands. Every night, it contracts. Add the vibration of a truck bed on corrugated track for 8 hours. Add the shock of being dropped. Add the load of being at the bottom of a stack 6 high. Thousands of cycles. And the folded layers, which were never fused, begin to move relative to one another by fractions of a millimeter, and the sealing compound ages and hardens and stops filling the gap. Then there is the liquid itself. Water has high surface tension and will sit happily in a joint that gasoline walks straight through. Gasoline is thin, aggressive, low in surface tension, and it attacks the compounds used to seal seams. It finds paths that water never will. A rolled seam container is fine for water. It is fine for oil. It is fine for 100 things. Richard Daniel, an American chemical engineer who ended up in the middle of all this, later wrote it as plainly as it can be written. Anyone who knows petroleum knows you do not store gasoline in a container with rolled seams. And the failure is not dramatic, which is precisely why it went unfixed for so long. A rolled seam does not burst. It does not send a jet of fuel across the truck bed and get somebody's attention. It weeps. A film of damp along a joint. A darker patch on the sand under a stack at midday. A smell that everyone had stopped noticing because everything in the desert smelled of petrol anyway. Nobody reports a smell. There is no form for it. A soldier who finds a can slightly light does not file anything. He just goes and gets another can. A depot that receives 92% of what was dispatched writes down what arrived, and the 8% that did not arrive is not a story. It is a rounding error. It only becomes a catastrophe when you sum it. 10,000 cans, each losing a few ounces a day, across a 2-week journey from Alexandria to a forward dump, is a fuel tanker's worth of petrol soaking into North Africa every week from a single supply route. American cans reached North Africa from late 1941 and through 1942 in quantity. They were better than the flimsies. That is the highest compliment available, and it is not much of one. They leaked less. They survived being dropped. They did not need a wrench, mostly. But against the German original, they were visibly, measurably, smellably worse, and the men handling them worked it out immediately and did what soldiers always do, which is to build an informal system that works around the official one. Allied quartermasters in the desert began sorting containers into 3 tiers, and although you will not find this in a manual, you will find it in the way units behaved. Captured German cans went to the operations that could not be allowed to fail: long-range patrols, armored spearheads, anything where a fuel shortfall meant men left in open ground. American cans went to the 2nd tier, the shorter hauls, the runs where a shortfall was survivable. Flimsies went to everything else, and if half of it arrived, fine. An army sorting its own new equipment below the enemy's is telling you something in the clearest possible language. In September 1942, Richard M. Daniel arrived in Egypt, sent out by the War Department to find out why fuel losses were being reported at levels that read like clerical errors. He was a chemical engineer, which turned out to matter, because he was looking at the containers as chemistry and materials rather than as stores. What he found was worse than the cables had suggested. He watched fuel go into the sand. He watched men wrestle screw caps with improvised tools. He watched a 2-man operation with a funnel to empty a can that a German soldier 50 miles away was emptying alone in 9 seconds. He worked out that the Allied logistics system was hemorrhaging the one commodity that made every other commodity meaningful, and that nobody at home understood it, because the losses were being reported as percentages in returns that nobody read. So he sent a cable to Washington saying that 40% of Allied fuel was being lost. Decades later, in a 1987 article he called "The Little Can That Could," Daniel admitted something that most men would have taken to the grave. He did not have a rigorous figure for 40%. It was an estimate, and he pitched it deliberately high because he had concluded that a moderate number would be filed and a shocking number would be acted on. I have thought about that admission a lot, and I have decided I do not hold it against him. He was not far off. Auchinleck's own estimate was 30%. That single documented convoy lost 57. Whatever the true theater-wide figure was, and it can never now be recovered, Daniel's 40 was closer to the truth than the silence it replaced. The cable worked. Washington finally paid attention, and it is worth being clear about why. Not because a man had warned them in 1940. Not because German engineering superiority had been sitting on a bench at Camp Holabird for 2 years. They moved because operations were now failing. Tanks were stopping. Advances were being planned around the assumption that a large fraction of the fuel would never show up. There is something quietly infuriating about how little of this exists on paper. Daniel himself noted how thin the official record was on the jerry can, and he was right. The organization that had turned the design down in 1940 was not eager to document what that decision had cost, and the men who noticed the problem first were mostly sergeants and corporals in supply companies whose names appear nowhere. That is normally where the trail goes cold for a family too, when a grandson opens a box of medals and photographs and has no idea what any of it means. It is why I wrote Find Your Grandfather's War, which is linked in the description below. It is a working guide to taking a name, a picture, and a handful of unexplained objects, and rebuilding an American serviceman's actual war from the records that do survive. Most of those men left more of a trail than their families ever realized. Now, before this becomes too tidy a story about German excellence, there is a complication that I think makes it far more interesting. In late August 1942, Rommel launched what turned out to be his final attempt to break through in Egypt at Alam el-Halfa. He was stopped, and the reason he was stopped had a great deal to do with fuel. He did not have enough of it, because tankers were being sunk in the Mediterranean, because his supply line ran hundreds of miles from Tripoli, because the Allies were reading his signals and knew when his fuel ships sailed. So the army with the best fuel container in the world lost the desert campaign partly for lack of fuel. That is not a contradiction. It is the actual lesson. A container is one link in a chain that starts at a refinery and ends in a carburetor, and a perfect link cannot compensate for a broken one further up. The Germans had solved the last 100 miles brilliantly and could not solve the first 2,000. The Allies had ships, escorts, refineries, and the Persian oil fields, and were losing a third of it in the last 100 miles. Each side had exactly what the other needed, which is what makes the fix so satisfying and so revealing about who was willing to swallow their pride. In 1943, British factories began mass-producing the German can. Not an adaptation of it, not an improvement on it, a faithful copy, welded seams exactly as Grünvogel had specified, the full internal breather tube, the proper lining, no clever cost reductions, no substitutions, no simplifications by an engineer who thought he could see a way to save a shilling. By early 1943, 2 million British-made jerry cans had shipped to North Africa. By early 1944, they were being manufactured in the Middle East as well, closer to where they were needed. Millions more followed into Italy, and then into the European campaign. They worked. Of course they worked. They did not leak, they took the heat, and later they took the mud, they stacked square, and a man could empty one alone in seconds. Every single thing the 1937 original did, the 1943 copy did, because it was the same object made by people who had decided to stop being clever. Meanwhile, American plants carried on producing rolled seam cans alongside the British welded ones, because retooling a running production line in the middle of a war is its own kind of impossible, and the two versions went to Europe together. And then Normandy turned the whole problem inside out. Fuel and petroleum products made up roughly half of everything shipped to overseas theaters by weight. Half. More than ammunition, more than food, more than every other category combined. A standard 2.5-ton truck, the workhorse of the American Army, could carry about 875 gallons of fuel when it was loaded with jerry cans, and there were thousands of those trucks running day and night behind the advance. The system that was supposed to keep this working was simple. A unit receiving full cans hands back the same number of empties. Can for can. One in, one out. The cans circulate, get refilled at the ports, and go forward again. On paper, it is a closed loop that needs no new production at all beyond replacement of damage. Armies in fast pursuit do not run closed loops. By August 1944, the Allied advance across France had turned into the kind of chase that supply officers have nightmares about. And in that month, the situation became genuinely absurd. There was fuel in the rear areas, plenty of it. What limited how much could be pushed forward to combat units was the shortage of containers to put it in. The petrol existed and could not travel because the empties never came back. Patton's Third Army, running flat out across France, outran its supply line and came to a halt near Metz in early September. Fuel shortage was part of it, alongside worsening weather and stiffening German resistance, and men who had been advancing 40 miles a day sat still and watched the Germans reorganize in front of them. By October 1944, the accounting caught up with reality, and the number is one of the strangest in the war. 3.5 million jerry cans were unaccounted for, not destroyed, not captured, unaccounted for. The can-for-can exchange had been widely ignored by units who had rather more urgent things on their minds, and the official logistics history describes what happened to them with something close to despair. They lay in a trail from Normandy to the West Wall. Hundreds of thousands were sitting in abandoned dumps and bivouac areas where a unit had moved on. Others had been pressed flat and laid down as walkways over mud. Others were being used as chairs. Some became stoves. Some became washstands. Some became latrine screens. Some marked the edges of tracks. Every one of those was a fuel container that a tank in front of Metz did not have. In early January 1945, the Quartermaster Corps recalculated what it actually needed, and the revision tells you how badly the original estimate had missed. Not 800,000 new cans a month, 1.3 million, every month. Because the Army had accepted that it would never see most of them again. By the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, over 19 million jerry cans had been required to support American forces in that theater alone. Total Allied production across all designs ran to somewhere around 21 or 22 million. 22 million copies of a container that had been offered to the United States for free in 1940 and turned down. In November 1944, Roosevelt made a public remark to the effect that without those cans, the American armies could not have moved across France at the speed they did. He was right, and the sentence deserves to be read with a little more weight than it usually gets. He was not praising American manufacturing. He was describing a German design, made properly by the British, without which the liberation of France would have moved at a walking pace. After the war, the argument ended quietly, in the way engineering arguments do, in the specifications. Post-war military standards for fuel containers mandated welded seams. Not recommended. Mandated. The rolled seam approach was abandoned outright for gasoline, and the American cans built that way became a curiosity, the kind of thing that turns up at military affairs and gets picked up by collectors who mostly do not know they are holding the losing side of an argument. The container that replaced it is the 1937 design. It has been codified and recodified through military specifications over the decades, and it is now the NATO standard 20-liter fuel container. And if you put a modern one next to Grunvogel's original, you would need to look closely to find the differences. Same capacity, same X pressed into both faces, same 3 handles in the same arrangement, same cam lever, same welded seam. Even the plastic versions sold today for expedition vehicles keep the shape, because the shape was never arbitrary in the first place. Nearly 90 years, and the fundamentals have not needed to change. You will find them on military bases, in UN relief convoys, strapped to the back of overland trucks in the Sahara, on farms, on boats, in the back of pickup trucks in every country on Earth. It is one of the very few objects designed in Germany in the 1930s that the world adopted permanently and without embarrassment, because it was simply correct. So what do you take away from a story about a fuel container? I keep landing on the same place, and it is not really about Germans or Americans. The American engineers at Camp Holabird were not stupid. They were solving a real problem, which was how to produce millions of containers quickly in factories that did not have welding lines, and rolled seams are a genuinely good answer to that problem. What they got wrong was subtler and much more common. They looked at a finished design and sorted its features into ones that mattered and ones that were implementation details, and they put the seam in the wrong pile. They kept everything visible: the shape, the handles, the X, the cap, the capacity. Every feature a person would notice holding it. And they changed the one thing a person would not, because from the outside, a seam is just how the two halves happen to be stuck together. But nobody had put the welded seam there because it was convenient. It was there because it was the only joint that would hold gasoline through 1,000 heat cycles, and somebody in Schwelm had presumably found that out the hard way in 1936, in a field trial, with a batch of cans that failed. The knowledge was in the design. It just was not written on the outside of it. That is the thing about inherited engineering. When you take over a working design, you also take over the answers to a lot of questions you never asked and do not know were asked. Every strange, expensive, apparently unnecessary feature is a scar. Somebody put it there because something went wrong. And when you remove it because you cannot see what it is for, you are not simplifying the design. You are rerunning an experiment that has already been run, at full scale, in a war, with fuel going into the sand. The desert did not care that the American can was 1.5 pounds lighter. The desert only cared whether the seam held. I think the reason this story has stayed with me is that it is not really finished. We do this constantly. Somebody takes a system that works, looks at the parts that seem redundant or costly or old-fashioned, strips them out, ships the leaner version, and finds out 18 months later why they were there. It happens in software, it happens in aircraft maintenance, it happens in medicine and in building codes and in everything else where the price of the lesson has already been paid by somebody else and the receipt has been thrown away. There is a discipline in the German approach that has nothing to do with genius. Run the tender. Build 5,000. Give them to soldiers for a year. Listen to what breaks. Fix it. Then adopt it. And then do not let anybody improve it in a way they cannot justify. And there is a discipline in what the British did in 1943 that I think is harder and more admirable. They had been humiliated by the flimsy for 3 years. They had watched their own men fight over captured enemy tins. And when they finally got production going, they did not build a British can. They built the German one exactly, down to the last unnecessary-looking crease, and swallowed everything that came with that. 22 million cans. 19 million to support one army in one theater. 3.5 million lying in the mud between Normandy and the German border being used as furniture. A 57% loss on a single convoy that a quartermaster signed off as a decent effort. And underneath all of it, one seam, on one container, changed by people who were sure it did not matter. Next time you see one of these, sitting on the back of a truck or in the corner of a garage, look at the line running down the middle of it, and remember what it cost to find out that the line had to be welded.